Finally, we've reached the last lesson and the last introductory video to that lesson in the dynamic sketching series. So that goes from plants at lesson 3 all the way to now vehicles at lesson 7. Just make sure that before you even think about tackling this lesson, you've gone through the basics, which are lessons 1 and 2. You've had a chance to complete the 250 box challenge and the 250 cylinder challenge, and you've gone through lessons 3, 4, 5, and 6. It's a very specific step-by-step process, and if you skip any of these lessons or challenges, you will probably struggle considerably with the material we'll be dealing with today. Also, unlike previous introductory videos, this one I actually did a separate video talking about certain techniques that will be useful today. I actually already uploaded this video. It's right here about measuring in perspective and constructing things to scale to match a certain proportion and so on. It's all about how to draw an actual proportional cube in space and then use that as a measuring tool to create larger frames and boxes that actually match the proportions you need. That'll be pretty useful, considering that for the most part, the box that you start off with, its proportions when you're dealing with especially like cars and things like that, it can be really challenging if your initial box is off. So you're definitely going to want to try and apply the technique that I cover in this video. And I was going to make it a part of this video, but I figured that it's also extremely useful just in general terms, so I made it its own self-contained little thing, so be sure to check it out. So this video is mainly just going to be the actual demo, and it's really just a breakdown of looking at this particular reference here and looking at how we can break it down into major forms and how we might attack it, and then trying to reconstruct it on the side. And as usual with these intro videos, I don't actually record my process of drawing them, I just go through step by step and explain what's going on. So you will find that there are a lot of similarities between this lesson and the one before it. The only major difference being that the scale of the objects we're dealing with are considerably larger. And like I mentioned before, with the whole proportional aspect of it, you might find that a lot of the objects that you might be drawing for this lesson rely more on accurate proportions than in the previous lesson. Like, they're still important in the previous lesson, but I know at the end of that one I focused on a demo with a computer mouse where the curvature and the form was just not really suited to, draw a box, then pile on another box and a cylinder onto it. It really had to be crafted within a certain framework. And you'll be dealing with a lot more of that in this lesson. So first, let's start breaking down this reference here. And I'm going to actually tone down the opacity on this layer so that we can see my lines a little bit better. So this here is just a simple, box. There's a lot of extra markings on it where I've tried to divide it up into sections. So this is your center line. Whoa. There we go. Okay, so this line here is your center line. You can see that because I've crossed the diagonals here and found that center point here. And everything else is just further subdivision. So this is our halfway mark. You've got your quarter, or 3/4 rather, 7/8 and so on. And so that's just giving a little bit more context to what those markings actually represent. I've also found center points here and elsewhere in the box, but we won't worry about that too much right now. So actually looking at the forms involved in this construction, I immediately want to start thinking about, okay, well, the whole bottom half of this block is pretty much taken up by the treads. And so it's pretty easy to block that out as, I mean, you could say that it's a tapered box here, or proper box here, and another tapered box here. The most important thing here is to generally keep it within the bounds of your actual original box. Like you'll see here that mine sticks out a little bit. That's just because I was, I probably should have extended my box all the way to this point, but I didn't, and I was just kind of working to compensate for my little mistakes. But in general, you do want to keep as snug as possible, especially with these major base forms, because they really help establish a foundation for the rest of your construction. And from here, it's just a matter of stacking your forms, just like we did in the everyday objects video. But you do have to be aware of little details, such as the fact that this is not a straight line. If you look at this form here, there is a subtle but significant slant to that surface. And so you want to make sure that you're aware of it and that you catch these details. Because if you don't, something is going to look off at the end and you won't really understand why it does. Then of course there's another box that now is following the same slant that was defined by this other surface. And finally you've got your turret, which is just another box with a... It's more of a compound box really. So you draw yourself a nice little box, find your center, then you draw another box around it. It's really nothing that different from the previous lesson here. And so on and so forth. And you've of course got this tube here for the cannon, which is really a series of cylinders that are all caught together. And that actually reminds me of something that I meant to say earlier on, but it's a very important point to make. And it's sort of unprecedented. For this lesson, I am perfectly okay with you using ballpoint pen or even a much smaller line weight to do these, all the subdivision, your initial box and everything, and even these sorts of very geometric block-ins of forms. Feel free to do that with ballpoint pen. Feel free to do it with a ruler. And later on when we start dealing with ellipses, feel free to use an ellipse guide. Ellipse guides, which you might not be entirely familiar with right now, look like this. And so it's just, there are a lot of different kinds that you can get, so you should definitely be careful with what you pick. I remember the first ellipse guide that I purchased actually ended up just being a bunch of circles. What you want instead is a bunch of varying degrees, like this image here shows. So they will usually come in steps of like 5 degrees or something like that. And they're all laid out. They're all laid out with different sizes, like this. So here you've got your 60-degree ellipses going down to a very small scale, all the way down to 15-degree ellipses and also scaling down. So these are very useful when you have to put down a very specific ellipse or you need concentric ellipses or anything like that. And while all of our lessons up until this point have really focused on the importance of being able to draw straight lines freehand and ellipses freehand, drawing through your ellipses and all of that, for this lesson and for the homework for this lesson, I want you to focus on understanding and applying the use of form and construction. And there's just so much more here to worry about than we've dealt with in the past. that I feel it would be a little bit too overwhelming to deal with all these different challenges while tackling this fairly new problem of having to, subdivide all this stuff and worry so much about having so many different lines in the playing field. You've already had to struggle with that in the last lesson, but for this one, I'm giving you guys a little bit of a break. So hopefully, you'll be able to deal with it with a little bit more ease. And if you are absolutely gung-ho about doing this freehand, you're welcome to try, but I do highly recommend that you do at least the first half of your homework using these tools. Of course, when you are actually drawing the final, not the final lines, but I mean, when you're actually getting into the more specific lines that actually make up this, whatever it is that you're drawing, not just blocking in forms and whatever, I do want you to start using your 0.5 fine liner, or felted pen. And especially for accentuating certain line weights and whatnot, and you will probably find that to be of great use and benefit to you, just because you'll be able to separate those lines much more easily from the underlying ballpoint framework. Additionally, you want to still make sure that your lines are confident. That's not really going to be a problem if you're using a ruler, but don't go out of your way to draw super faintly. I mean, the tools will probably take care of most of it for you. Working in a ballpoint pen is, going to be much lighter and much easier to work with without having to tone down your confidence with your line work. So yeah, feel free to do all of this and not to kill yourselves trying to draw a whole lot of perfect ellipses on the first try, because you will cry. Even when I'm doing my demos, I use the Lazy Nezumi plugin. I don't actually use it for its main purpose, which is smoothing your lines, but it comes with a great concentric ellipse constraint, which you can modify in terms of degree, and you can slide it along its minor axis, and you can rotate it, and it's very handy for doing digital work. And you've probably seen me use this plenty in the past. So yeah, feel free to do that. It's no problem, and it's going to help you focus more on what each exercise and what the homework really needs you to focus on, so that you actually improve and focus on the meat of the lesson. So this is basically the construction of this tank. A bunch of boxes with tapered forms and so on. Not that difficult. So the next step that I follow here is that I actually try and take this whole face here and I try and, actually it would be up to here, I suppose, try and build an orthographic view, a side view, as a proportional study. So this helps me better understand that, okay, this is my center, this is the first eighth, and it helps me situate different features, and like where this turret ends is maybe a little bit beyond the halfway point. And I'm using the reference points that I've gotten from these subdivisions. You do have to be a little bit careful because there is perspective distortion on this, so it's going to be at times a little bit difficult to situate different details. And also, this turret might, well, it's definitely not actually snug against this plane. If you actually looked at it from the front, it would be more like it would look somewhat more like this, where these are your treads down here, and you have your little But the important thing is that we're drawing, this whole face is this plane here. And that's also where we've got these little subdivisions. So since there's this whole distance here between the actual turret, which is this line that we're looking at, and the actual center line that we're trying to reference against, this detail, if you bring it actually forward to the plane, might actually end up being situated here or here. So you can't compare it one-to-one like that. You have to make certain compensations, and you have to kind of guess to some of it. You could always do everything much more scientifically, but that would take a hell of a lot of time and effort, and that's not really what we're after. This whole process already takes a lot longer than we're used to in terms of how I tackle things in my lessons. And it gets a lot more technical, so we still want to tone that down. We just want to rely on what's absolutely necessary. So here, this turret probably actually goes a little bit further, but you know, a mistake's a mistake. It's a minor one, not a big deal. And at the end of the day, what I always tell people, and actually I was doing a demo for someone earlier this week where they were having trouble drawing a bird. And I drew the same bird for them, and I told them flat out that if you were to bring in the reference image and compare it to my drawing of the bird, I'd look like an idiot. But if you held up my drawing of the bird on its own, it looks like a bird. It even looks like the same kind of bird, the same species of bird, probably. Maybe a few little deviations. But the important thing that it's believable and it's plausible. And I constructed that from a single reference image, and it was my first attempt, basically. I had not studied this bird previously. If you really, really want to draw that exact bird, that's not what my lessons really talk about. My lessons talk about constructing things that seem plausible. And furthermore, my lessons would extend, and these techniques do extend to being able to draw that same bird from different angles and different positions. But in order to do that, you need to actually go through the process of really studying that bird from many different angles, understanding its relationships between its beaks, doing a lot of different studies, basically. So your first one isn't necessarily going to look like it's the identical thing. You might have to do a whole body of studies before you start being able to nail that, the appearance of that bird, or that species of bird. But the important thing is that for that first drawing, it just needs to look plausible. Now the same thing applies here. I made a mistake with where I positioned the end of the turret, probably. I'll have to actually look at it closely to figure that out. But the important thing is that there could just as well be another tank that has its turret slightly forward. Might not be the exact same model, but it does look and feel like a tank. And that's what we're after right now. If you want to draw a very specific tank, study that tank a lot. Do a lot of drawings. And then nail it in your final drawing. You'll still be applying the same principles and the same kinds of use of form and construction, but that's basically the length that you'll have to go to achieve that goal. Anyways, back to what I'm doing here. I'm getting rather distracted. So with this proportional study, I want to now use it to reconstruct my tank, but from, I don't actually usually try and reproduce this exact angle, because I'm more interested in understanding the forms that are involved and how they relate to each other. So I start off with a box. I should probably move all this up a little bit. All right, so we've got a box. Surprise, surprise. In the other video that I mentioned earlier where we talk about constructing with scale, you could use, and you probably should use, that technique to construct this initial box so that it actually matches a certain scale that you've defined here. I kind of skipped that step. I decided that, this was the box I wanted to use. I wanted to jump straight into it just so that I could get through this demo quickly. So I am skipping a few steps. Be aware of that. You should still take the time to construct your box to scale. So just as I've done in this rectangle, and I've subdivided out to halves and quarters and eighths, so that I could figure out where everything is situated relative to these lines. I do the same thing here. So you see I actually marked out even 1/8, 1/4, 3/8, half, whatever. It really, and marking it out actually really helped me throughout the process, because there ends up being so many lines that it's very easy to mistake one line for another, and if you do that without catching yourself, you're going to end up messing up the whole thing. So you need to keep track of where everything is. And the next step is just to take this view here, this whole orthographic view, and carry it over onto this plane. And it's just a matter of replicating the grid and matching the grid. So it's the same thing. I've got my slant here in this line, my somewhat tapered box, and my full box here, and then the other awkwardly trapezoidal form, and so on and so forth. This is all stuff that you would have dealt with in the previous lesson, and it shouldn't really be a problem. Notice though that I did carry my turret a little bit too, I stuck the turret right on there. I'm not really sure if it would come that close. It probably wouldn't, but we'll deal with that later, maybe. And now we take this orthographic view and we just extrude it into 3D space. And if you're familiar with any 3D modeling or anything like that, you should know exactly what extruding means. It means taking a two-dimensional object and just extending it into a third dimension. So it just replicates the exact same form into 3D. So we'll do the same thing here. And notice that the back of the turret is taller, and I actually factored that in here. So I want to make sure that I carry over the same detail and information here. And I could have constructed it as a box with an extra form on top. Whatever makes you happy, do it either way, whatever you're comfortable with. So next I just start refining my forms, and I've got this these treads. I have them in a specific distance from the center. This is the center line. And so I did draw this one first, and I wanted to carry over that same measurement onto, I wanted to mirror it across the center line. So in order to do that, I just, where is it? Well, I'm not exactly sure where my lines are for this, but what you can do is you can just drop this measurement down to here, and you can use the center point of this whole plane and the center point is, of course, where the diagonals cross. So right here. And you can just mirror, or you can pass a line from this point that you want to mirror through the center. Oh, there is a line. Actually, no, it's not. But anyways, you can pass it through that center point. Sorry about that noise. Oh, for God's sake. I think they're done. I live right by the harbor, and cruise ships tend to make a lot of noise just before they leave, because apparently everyone needs to know that they're leaving. Anyway, as I was saying, if you pass a line through the point that you're mirroring, the center point, and find out where that line intersects with the top of this plane, almost, you can then bring that same measurement down, and this is more or less where it would be mirrored across to. So I know that I want to stop I want my tread to be separated at around this location. So that's how I was able to figure out that measurement here. And again, that's a technique that I've described in the past. So now I do want to start getting into the incredibly annoying cylinders. So I have to start off with my minor axis, which goes off to the exact same vanishing point as any of these lines. Yeah. So they all, and this is my new minor axis, they all go off to the same vanishing point. So when drawing this one, I relied on any other nearby lines. So there's one here, they're all not the most visible things in the world. But anyway, so I estimated this mainly against these two marks. So I want to keep my convergence consistent. And the horizon line is also a very useful tool in this regard. Because I know that the horizon is where the angles, or not the angles, but the general slant of this against this changes, and I know that everything flattens out when it reaches the horizon. So anyway, that lets me construct my minor axis, and from that I create basic ellipse. I want to make sure that the contact points here and here are vertically aligned, so that I do know that this ellipse, despite being so narrow, does actually represent a circle in 3 dimensions. And that's very important for our driving wheel, or driving gear, or whatever it's called. And I turn that into a cylinder. Same deal, I also have to test this one to make sure that its contact points are vertically aligned. And now this next step is going to be a bit of a jump, but really all it is a bunch of ellipses with more ellipses inside of them. It's not really that big of a difference, really. I mean, you could leave out those details. I just, at the time, since I'm using this tool, lining up my ellipses can be tough after the fact. So once I've actually gotten an ellipse down, laying in those initial concentric ellipses, the ones inside, helps immensely. So that I don't, because once I change these settings, because I don't go around remembering what's the degree and angle and all that is, or even where the center properly was. Once I have to get back here, it's a little bit annoying to actually line them up and figure out where everything sits properly. So that's why I did them all in one go. Beauty is working digitally. And now it's just a matter of adding more detail. So these treads here, let's get rid of this. These treads wrap around the wheels and they kind of curve. So I wanted to capture that detail. I wanted to refine my turret, so adding on the extra box, cutting off one of my corners here to smooth it out and bevel the edge a bit. Establishing a base for the cannon, so there is another ellipse there whose contact points are vertically aligned. It is a circle. And with the cannon, it is, like, I also constructed this minor axis here. Again, should be aligned to the exact same vanishing point, or towards roughly that vanishing point. And then around it, I construct several. So what I did to actually achieve this was, it's probably a little bit easier with an ellipse guide, as long as you can line up along the minor axis. But all I did initially was draw an ellipse, draw another ellipse, and then once I get further out, I do need to make sure that my degree changes. So sometimes drawing a box, like you'll see here, I did draw a plane to match this far ellipse here, so that I knew it would be circular and have the correct degree. But here I'm just kind of quickly doing this for demonstration's sake. Having a bunch of ellipses coming out like this can really help you establish a form without ever drawing the cylinders themselves. And then you can start connecting the ellipses to construct the rest of the form. So everything really is just a matter of building up other smaller shapes and forms before wrapping them up in the main construction. So while it may look complicated at first, it's really just a bunch of ellipses that are aligned to the exact same minor axis. That's what a cylinder is, and you can create these compound cylinders to create more complex forms. And of course, when I actually did this, I wasn't paying that much attention to this, all the additional ellipses. So you may want to go quite far with how many ellipses you lay in. And the finer detail, or the finer level of the details that you're actually observing and trying to copy over, in terms of construction at least, the better and the more accurate and the more believable and plausible your construction will be. And then from here, this is all pretty much a tank. There's nothing, like, all the parts are here, and all the construction is done. If you ignore all the extra lines, and you can ignore them by actually just accentuating the line weight of the lines that you've already got, but it's all really just, you've got your treads, you've got your body, you've got your cannon, you've got your turret. It's a tank. It's just a matter of bringing the tank out of it. And so I do that by now going quite heavy on filling areas in with, like filling in the dark areas and making sure that the focus in your eye focuses on where it's supposed to go. So this does look like a huge jump, but really I'm just filling areas in. It's almost like drawing in a coloring book. But you do have to make sure that these, if you want to fill a shape in, you do fill it in completely. And using a brush pen can often be quite helpful with this. So if you instead were to do this, and be sloppy and half-assed with it, then it's going to look, not only is it going to look sloppy, it's also going to be really distracting because all these little slivers of white really shine through and they just catch your eye, and it's very frustrating, and it's really not where you want your viewer to be focusing. So you need to make sure that you go as far as you can to fill those shapes in completely. And notice here I did, like, so on cylinders it can really help to once you've got a cylinder, adding a form shadow, just like this, along its length helps a lot to show that it's, just to reinforce its curvature, really. And the important parts are that the shadow does not touch the far edge, so it's not coming all the way to the edge. Because there is always, because it's a rounded surface, there's always light that's going to hit it from behind, and it's going to brighten that area up. So having that little edge of white really helps to reinforce that curvature. And additionally, what you don't want to do is any sort of hatching like this. You want it to, because that's really going to, the straight lines are going to flatten the form out, but also having a bunch of small short segments like that, it just doesn't look right. So instead, go lengthwise and use longer strokes. And try not to use the same thickness on both sides. So this one is thinner, this one is thicker. It just helps keep things more dynamic. So you'll notice that I did that right here. I just added on one side a little bit of a form shadow. And remember that in general, I don't necessarily use shading as a means to actually show form. Cylinders is one of the places where it's particularly effective, but it is still a secondary aspect to the construction itself. But generally, I'll use shadow just to separate shapes out. So filling in the dark spots between the cover here and the treads really helps the treads pop out. And same with filling in the gaps between these wheels. And you'll also notice that I pushed the details further, and while they are cast shadows, like here you've got a cast shadow coming from the cover, it really does help separate your forms out, and that's my main goal. And that's pretty much it. I just took a little bit further with a drop shadow and a frame, and just to be pretty. But that's the gist of it. So I'm hoping that that did help. I know I rambled a little bit, probably a little bit more than usual, but that use of subdividing your boxes, matching things up from the orthographic study to the three-dimensional box and plane, it should really help you lay in your initial major shapes or forms. Remember that you don't want to try and capture every little detail right off the bat. You want to focus on your major forms initially, and that should be a concept that should already be familiar to you, since that's pretty much what we've talked about in all of the previous lessons. Start with your major forms, then break them down and refine them. This is the most important step right here, establishing those big blocky masses. And so that's pretty much it. I'm going to be doing 3 more demos. I'm not entirely sure what they're going to be of. I'm thinking at least one of them will be a car, because my previous demo of the car was not great, and applying these new methods will definitely help in that area. I'm going to leave the 2 of the current demos that are up right now there. There's one of a tank and one of a train. They still have some value, but they don't apply as much of this methodology as I would like. So I'm thinking maybe a ship and I don't know what else. A ship, maybe a truck, something like that. We'll see. But anyways, yeah, hope this helped, and have fun drawing.